Pascal, sure you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much you said there, Tori, that was so important. But the question I have is that why has there never been any effective rebuttal by the left to these types of ideologies that have been so perniciously plaguing black and brown communities, particularly in the face of people like Charles Murray. Though I read a wonderful rebuttal of Charles Murray from your dad a few years back that was, I think, originally in the Nation. But there seems that our fair complexioned friends on the left have never been able to be aroused enough by concern about this to really take it head on. But this is one of the most pernicious ways in which policy disqualifies poor and working class, well, definitely poor black people from any kind of policy remuneration.
That's a great question. I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Pascal?
No, that's it.
Okay. Well, I'm going to set the Wayback Machine dial just again back to about 20 years before Reagan, to at least start to answer that question. There was certainly a left response to the culture poverty thesis, and to be fair, the culture poverty thesis didn't necessarily come out of conservative. It wasn't simply the product of conservative hands, but again, in the period between the March on Washington and King's assassination, and maybe even a little longer, there was a pushback by people like Michael Harrington, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, against the culturalist, or I'm going to call it racialist, because I do think culture poverty thesis and its successor underclass ideology are really not culturalist explanations at all. They're fundamentally racialist and, dare I say, racist explanations for inequality. But people like those individuals who I named absolutely pushed back against it. And it sounds a little funny because Harrington, of course, helped to popularize the culture of poverty himself, but he was a leftist, right? And certainly by today's standards, he was a leftist. And those three individuals who I named, again, I guess I will remind you, Ava Brandon, Bayard Rustin, Michael Harrington, we can throw in Charles Killingsworth, because now I'll just check off items from chapter 3 of Toward Freedom. We're very critical of the culture of poverty thesis along the lines that I've already articulated. Why didn't they win? Because I think there was a lot of evidence to support their claim. They didn't win because the weight of politics was against them, practically, right? Because they were coming at this from a grassroots counter hegemonic framework. But by the time that we get to the Johnson administration, the economic politics had shifted to the right. Now that's hard for us to conceptualize today because that's the era of Keynesianism. But what I think people tend not to appreciate is that there were a couple of more competing models of Keynesianism. And those who are coming at it from the kind of, I think it would be called secular stagnationist framework, sometimes maybe industrial or institutional Keynesians, took the position that the government needed to intervene directly in private markets, housing and labor markets, to establish a full employment economy. The Keynesians who won, and to be clear, those secular stagnationist type Keynesians, institutional or industrial Keynesians, were people like Killingsworth or Rustin or Randolph or even Harrington. The Keynesians who won were called commercial Keynesians. And I know that you guys have heard the expression "a rising tide raises all boats,"
Mm-hmm.
right? One thing that was interesting when that came back into the popular conscience about 10 years ago, I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates's "The Case for Reparations," or maybe it was a subsequent piece where he brought it up. And certainly in around the Sanders campaign, he brought up that expression describing that phrase. Um,
Obama used it first.
Maybe,
Obama
but
used
but I'm making a specific point. So let me make this specific point to lay out what I'm talking about. So when Coates brought it up, he brought it up to criticize Bernie Sanders, and he described Bernie Sanders as advancing the same "a rising tide raises all boats" kind of approach to liberalism that had doomed post-war liberalism, ensured that post-war liberalism would fail to do right by Black Americans. Now, he wasn't wrong that rising tide raises all boats, approach to liberalism had in fact failed Black Americans. But where he was wrong, and this is the thing that has struck me as really unfortunate, at minimum, about how people have took that phrase many years after the fact, is what a rising tide raises all boats referred to, the metaphor, wasn't the kind of downward redistribution politics that Bernie Sanders or Charles Killingsworth or Ava Randolph or Bayard Rustin or Michael Harrington had advocated in the 1960s. It was in fact the precursor to trickle down. What a rising tide raises all boats referred to, it came out of the New England Chamber of Commerce. There have been some very progressive things that have come out of New England. Nothing progressive has come out of a Chamber of Commerce anywhere. So it was the New England Chamber of Commerce's mantra, I believe, in the 1960s. JFK's speechwriter, I believe it was Ted Sorensen, had picked it up. And it was a case for the tax cuts that the Kennedy and Johnson administrations had ultimately implemented. So when Eisenhower was president, the highest marginal income tax bracket was about 90 or 91%. The Kennedy Johnson administration would lower it down to, I think, 77, 75%, and then eventually 70%, which sounds unconscionably high to us today. But it was a significant cut in taxes over the Eisenhower years. And the point of those tax cuts was to redress poverty by growing the economy. The metaphor was not trickle down, but the end game was trickle down. Culture of poverty theory, the culture of poverty theory, was wed at that point to trickle down in the 1960s because the presumption was that black unemployment, the presumption that drove liberalism, commercial Keynesians specifically, was that black unemployment was exceptional to capitalism. It was, again, the product of bad actors in the form of racist white people, hence the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1968, but also the result of bad actors in the form of perhaps as many as 25% of the black poor. One of the reasons, to get back to your point, Pascal, because I wanted to add that texture, that the progressives lost then is they couldn't possibly win. The money wasn't on their side. Fast forward, the weight of history should have been on their side, right? They had a better argument. But no matter what Rachel Maddow says or Chris Hayes, it's not about winning the argument, right? Power wants what it wants when it wants it because it wants it, and power can get what it wants when it wants it because it wants it, no matter how misguided power is, right? When you pull this up, set the Wayback Machine dial up 20 years to the Reagan years, well, again, there's no mobilized left at that point. There's no means of fighting back. The Dems had shifted even further to the right with Jimmy Carter, who sort of presaged what Reaganism would be. And in that context, if you want to be, let's say, an academic, and there's a great book by a historian named Alice O'Connor. It's kind of a tome called Poverty Knowledge, and it is on the study of the academic study of poverty going back to W.B. Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, and it goes all the way, I believe, to Clinton. And one of the points that she makes about Reagan is Reagan augured a sea change in policy circles, insofar as Reagan no longer went to academics. Beginning with Roosevelt, Democrats and Republicans would turn to academics for input, right? Psychology as a field gets a big boost after World War II or during World War II in this process, but sociology, et cetera, also got bumps, right? When you get to Reagan, he's done with them, and he just goes to right-wing think tanks. And so at that point, if you want to have a certain kind of career as an academic, you can't criticize culture of poverty, or I should say underclass ideology, because that is now hegemonic, or I should say it's mainstream by Reagan and becomes hegemonic by Clinton. And by the 90s, easy, maybe even with the publication of William Julius Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged in 87, it's the last thing I'm going to say, by the way. Then if you want to be taken seriously as a liberal left academic, you just have to co-sign this narrative that poor black people suck. Right?